The encounter. The late afternoon sun painted the city streets in a golden hue, casting long shadows over the bustling sidewalks. People hurried past one another, lost in their own lives, their minds occupied with dinner plans, unread emails, and the exhaustion of a long workday. Among them, moving at a much slower pace, was an elderly man named Walter Thompson. His steps were deliberate, his body slightly hunched, but there was a quiet dignity about him. His worn-out brown coat, though patched in places, was clean, and his scuffed shoes had seen many miles but were neatly laced. In his right hand, he gripped a wooden cane, steadying himself with each step. In his left, he carried a small cloth bag filled with coins. He had spent the last few weeks collecting loose change. Pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters, each one tucked away carefully into an old ceramic jar at home. Today, after counting them meticulously, he realized he had just enough to buy a small loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a can of soup. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for a few meals. As he reached the entrance of a local grocery store, he paused for a moment, taking in the bright lights and the hum of activity inside. People maneuvered through the aisles with their carts, some chatting, others checking their phones absent-mindedly as they picked out their items. Walter stepped inside, his body adjusting to the artificial coolness of the air conditioning. The scent of freshly baked bread mixed with the citrusy aroma of fruit nearby. He moved toward the aisles with careful steps, selecting his items with precision. A small loaf of whole wheat bread, a can of tomato soup, a carton of milk. He looked at each price tag, mentally tallying up the total. Satisfied, he made his way toward the checkout counter. The lines were long. People stood impatiently, tapping their feet, shifting their weight, glancing at their watches. Walter took his place at the end of one of the lines, gripping the cloth bag a little tighter. He had always preferred to shop at quieter hours, but today he had no choice. He waited patiently, watching as customers in front of him swiped their credit cards or tapped their phones against the card reader, completing their transactions in mere seconds. When it was finally his turn, he stepped forward and placed his items gently onto the conveyor belt. The cashier barely looked at him. She was a young woman, likely in her early 20s, with sleek brown hair tied up in a ponytail. Her name tag read Emily. She moved quickly, scanning his items and calling out the total in a disinterested tone. Walter nodded and reached into his cloth bag, carefully pulling out a handful of coins. He set them on the counter and began counting. It didn't take long for Emily to notice what he was doing. Her fingers, which had been tapping impatiently on the register, stopped. She stared at the growing pile of coins in front of her, her expression shifting from boredom to irritation. "Wait, are you paying in coins?" she asked, her voice carrying more disbelief than was necessary. Walter looked up and offered a small smile. "Yes, ma'am. I saved them." Emily exhaled loudly, making no effort to hide her annoyance. "Sir, you should have brought cash. I can't stand here counting all of these." Walter's hands trembled slightly, but he kept his composure. "I counted them at home. It should be the right amount." She let out a short laugh, shaking her head as she glanced at the line behind him. "Look, we're really busy. You're holding people up." A few impatient murmurs rippled through the crowd. Walter could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on him. He knew people were in a hurry, but this was the only money he had. A man in a gray business suit standing behind him sighed dramatically and muttered, "Oh, come on. This is ridiculous." Another customer, a woman with a cart full of groceries, leaned toward a friend and whispered, "Why do they even let people pay like that?" Walter's grip on his cane tightened. He had lived through war, through hunger, through losing people he loved, but this feeling of being a burden, was something he would never get used to. Emily crossed her arms and looked around the store, as if expecting someone to come to her rescue. "I don't have time for this. Maybe you should come back when you have real money." Walter blinked. He opened his mouth as if to respond but hesitated. His voice had always been steady, but now, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to say. The moment stretched, uncomfortable and heavy. Then a voice, calm, steady, but unmistakably authoritative, broke through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The store fell silent. Emily turned toward the voice, her irritation faltering for just a second. The customers in line instinctively looked in the same direction. A man had stepped forward from the back of the line. He was dressed casually, dark jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had been standing quietly, unnoticed by most, watching the entire interaction unfold. But now, as he took off his sunglasses, recognition flickered across the faces of those around him. The murmurs started almost immediately. "Wait, is that? Oh my God. That's Keanu Reeves." Emily's eyes widened as the realization hit her. The air seemed to shift, the once indifferent crowd suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. Keanu Reeves took another step forward, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady as he looked from Emily to Walter. And then, in the gentlest tone, he asked, "Would you mind if I paid for this?" The revelation. A hush fell over the store as Keanu Reeves stood there, his gaze fixed on the startled cashier. His voice had been calm, but it carried a quiet authority that demanded attention. The customers who had previously muttered impatiently now stood frozen, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected presence of a global movie star in their neighborhood grocery store. Emily, the young cashier, stared at Keanu, her face caught between shock and embarrassment. Her fingers twitched slightly as she gripped the edge of the register. You want to pay for it," she stammered, her earlier confidence slipping away. Keanu gave a small nod. "Yes," he said simply, then turned to Walter. "If that's okay with you, sir." Walter blinked, clearly taken aback. Of all the things he had imagined might happen today, this was not one of them. His eyes, worn with the passage of time, studied Keanu carefully. The man standing before him had an air of humility, despite the whispers of awe from the surrounding crowd. Walter hesitated, then shook his head gently. "That's very kind of you, son," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But I can pay for my own groceries." A flicker of admiration passed through Keanu's eyes. He respected that. There was something in Walter's demeanor that reminded him of the men he had met throughout his life, men who had seen hardships but carried their struggles with dignity. The businessman in the gray suit, still standing behind Walter, let out an impatient sigh. "For God's sake, just let him pay so we can move on." Keanu's gaze flicked toward the man, his expression unchanged, but there was something in the way he looked at him that made the businessman shift uncomfortably. Walter straightened slightly, his grip on his cane tightening. He turned back to Emily and carefully picked up another handful of coins, placing them on the counter. "It should all be there," he said. "Please, go ahead and count it." Emily hesitated, her cheeks flushing. She knew there was no way out of this now. Slowly, she began picking up the coins, her movements noticeably less dismissive than before. The once impatient crowd was now uncomfortably quiet, watching as the young woman, who had moments ago tried to turn Walter away, was now meticulously counting the very money she had deemed unworthy. Keanu remained where he was, watching silently. The sound of coins clinking against the counter seemed louder than it should have been. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily cleared her throat. "It's all here," she mumbled, avoiding Walter's eyes. She bagged the items quickly and slid them across the counter. Walter took the bag with a polite nod. "Thank you, young lady," he said, his voice carrying no bitterness. As he turned to leave, Keanu gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Would you mind if I walked with you for a bit?" Walter looked at him in surprise, then gave a small chuckle. "Well, I suppose I can't say no to a Hollywood star, can I?" Keanu grinned, and together they made their way out of the store. The murmurs inside resumed the moment they stepped outside, but neither of them paid attention. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the city. Walter moved slowly, using his cane for support, while Keanu walked beside him, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the street filled the air, the occasional honk of a car horn, the distant chatter of pedestrians, the rhythmic tapping of Walter's cane against the pavement. Finally, Keanu broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Walter nodded. "Go ahead." Keanu hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Why didn't you let me pay for your groceries back there?" Walter chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not because I didn't appreciate the offer," he said. "It's just, I've spent my whole life working hard to stand on my own feet. I may not have much, but what I do have, I've earned. It's important to me to pay my own way, even if it's just a few coins at a time." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "I respect that," he said. "A lot of people wouldn't have turned down the offer." Walter smiled, his face lined with years of experience. "I've seen a lot in my time, son," he said. "And if I've learned anything, it's that dignity isn't about how much money you have. It's about how you carry yourself." Keanu was silent for a moment, absorbing Walter's words. There was something about the old man's wisdom that struck a chord deep within him. They walked a little further before Walter gestured toward a small diner on the corner of the street. "Care to join me for a cup of coffee?" he asked. Keanu grinned. "I'd like that." They stepped inside the diner, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. The place was cozy, with red vinyl booths and a jukebox playing an old tune in the corner. A waitress approached them with a warm smile, not seeming to recognize Keanu. They slid into a booth, and the waitress poured them 2 cups of steaming coffee. As Walter stirred a packet of sugar into his cup, he glanced at Keanu. "You know, I've been around long enough to recognize when someone has more on their mind than they let on." Keanu looked up, caught off guard. Walter smiled knowingly. "So tell me, son, what's really going on with you?" Keanu hesitated. It wasn't often that people saw past his fame and actually asked how he was doing. He took a sip of coffee, considering his words carefully. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might actually be ready to answer. A conversation that changes everything. The small diner hummed with quiet chatter as Keanu and Walter sat across from each other in a red vinyl booth. The soft glow of the hanging lights reflected off the chrome-rimmed table, casting a warm, inviting atmosphere. The clinking of coffee cups and the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby table filled the space, but between them, a calm stillness settled. Walter took a slow sip of his coffee, his weathered hands wrapped around the ceramic mug. He studied Keanu carefully, his old but sharp eyes searching the younger man's face. He had seen a lot of people in his lifetime. Some genuine, some pretending. But Keanu seemed different. "You know," Walter finally said, setting his cup down, "most people don't stop to help strangers anymore. Especially not someone like you." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Like me?" Walter chuckled. "A movie star. A rich man. Someone who could have been anywhere in the world today. But instead, you ended up in a small grocery store watching an old man count his pennies." Keanu smiled slightly. "I like places like this. Small towns, real people. Sometimes, I just need to step away from everything. The cameras, the expectations." Walter nodded in understanding. "Fame can be a lonely thing, I imagine." Keanu's smile faded just a little. He traced the rim of his coffee cup with his thumb, thinking about Walter's words. There was truth in them, a truth that not many people understood. Walter leaned back in his seat, stretching his legs slightly. "I've been around long enough to know that when a man like you stops to help an old stranger like me, there's usually a reason. Something bigger on his mind." Keanu looked up, meeting Walter's gaze. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, with a deep breath, he finally spoke. "I guess I just saw something in you," he admitted. "Something that reminded me of someone I used to know." Walter tilted his head. "Someone important?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah, a long time ago, when I was a kid, my mother, and I were struggling. We didn't have much. Some days, we barely had enough for food. There was a man, an older man, who helped us when we needed it most. Gave us food, helped my mom find a warm coat for me one winter. I never got to thank him. Never even knew his name. But I never forgot him. Walter listened intently, his face unreadable. And you think I remind you of him? Keanu chuckled softly, shaking his head. It's not just that. It's the way you carried yourself today. You had every reason to be upset in that store, but you weren't. You stayed kind, even when people were treating you unfairly. Not a lot of people do that anymore. Walter let the words settle between them. He took another sip of his coffee, thinking carefully before he spoke. You know, he said, kindness doesn't cost a thing. I learned that a long time ago. Life will take a lot from you. Money, people you love, even time itself. But if you can hold on to kindness, you'll never be truly poor. Keanu nodded slowly, absorbing Walter's words. The waitress returned, refilling their coffee cups. She smiled warmly at Walter. Haven't seen you in here for a while, Mr. Thompson, she said. How've you been? Walter smiled back. Oh, you know, still kicking. She laughed. Well, it's good to see you. She turned to Keanu, still oblivious to who he was. And you, sir. I don't think I've seen you around before. Visiting. Keanu smiled. Something like that. She nodded and walked away, leaving the two men alone again. Walter sighed, tapping his fingers against the table. Life has a funny way of bringing people together, doesn't it? Keanu tilted his head. What do you mean? Walter gave a small smile. You said a man helped you when you were young. Maybe today was your chance to return the favor, to pay it forward. Keanu considered that for a moment, then nodded. Maybe. A comfortable silence settled between them. Keanu leaned back, watching the people in the diner go about their lives. Ordinary, simple, real. For the first time in a long while, he felt a kind of peace he hadn't known he was searching for. Then Walter's voice cut through the quiet. You know, I once helped a young boy and his mother many years ago, he said thoughtfully. They were struggling. It was a cold winter, and they didn't have much. I gave them some food and a warm coat for the boy. Never saw them again, but I always hoped they were okay. Keanu's breath hitched. He turned to Walter, his heart pounding just a little faster. It couldn't be. Could it? Walter sipped his coffee, lost in thought. Keanu studied the old man's face, really studied him. The lines, the eyes, the kindness in them. And suddenly, a memory from decades ago flooded his mind. A warm coat, a small act of kindness, an old man's reassuring smile. Keanu swallowed hard. He hadn't expected this. This wasn't just a chance meeting. This was fate. The hidden connection. Keanu stared at Walter, his mind racing. The memory was distant, blurred by time, but the more he looked at the old man, the clearer it became. A snowy night, a young boy, him, shivering beside his mother, the weight of hunger and exhaustion pressing down on them, and then a man appearing out of the cold, offering warmth in the form of a coat, a meal, and something much more valuable. Kindness. Could it really be the same man? Walter, unaware of Keanu's revelation, continued sipping his coffee. His eyes had the faraway look of someone lost in memories, but there was no expectation in them. He had told the story casually, with no thought that it might hold deeper significance. Keanu took a slow breath, steadying himself. He could feel his pulse in his ears. Walter, he began, his voice quieter than before. That boy, the one you helped all those years ago. Do you remember what he looked like? Walter chuckled, setting his cup down. Well, it's been decades, he said. But I do remember his eyes. Big, dark eyes, full of worry. His mother was a kind woman. Tired, but kind. I remember giving them some food, and I had an old coat. I gave it to the boy because he was shaking so badly. I told him, Someday, when you're able, help someone else who needs it. Keanu inhaled sharply. His hands clenched around his coffee cup as the memory fully crashed into him. It was him. The little boy in Walter's story was him. A flood of emotions surged through Keanu. Gratitude, disbelief, admiration. He had always wondered about that man, the one who had stepped out of the shadows during one of the hardest nights of his life. And now, after all these years, after all the success, the fame, the wealth, here he was, sitting across from him, completely unaware of what he had done all those years ago. Walter must have sensed something change in Keanu's expression because he tilted his head. "Son, you look like you've just seen a ghost," he said, chuckling softly. Keanu exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure how to say it, how to tell Walter the truth. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Walter, that boy was me." Walter frowned, not understanding at first. "What?" Keanu swallowed hard. "That little boy you helped, the one you gave food and a coat to, that was me." Walter blinked. He stared at Keanu, his face unreadable, his mind processing the words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the hum of the diner around them, the clinking of plates, the murmur of distant conversations. Then Walter's eyes widened. His breath caught in his throat. "You," his voice was barely above a whisper. "You were that boy." Keanu nodded, his throat tight. "My mother and I were struggling. That winter was one of the hardest times in our lives. I remember that night so clearly. You didn't just give me a coat, Walter. You gave me hope. You told me to pass kindness forward. And I never forgot that." Walter's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His hands, those same hands that had once wrapped a coat around a shivering boy, trembled slightly as he rested them on the table. His eyes glistened with something unspoken. For the first time in a long while, Walter felt the weight of his years settle upon him. He had never expected to see that child again, much less to discover that the boy he had helped had grown into one of the most well-known and beloved actors in the world. Keanu saw the emotions flicker across Walter's face, and he reached out, resting his hand on the old man's. "Walter, I never got to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You changed my life that night. I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't helped us." Walter took a shaky breath. His lips quivered slightly, but then he chuckled, soft, warm, disbelieving. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. He shook his head in wonder. "All these years, I always wondered what happened to that boy." He chuckled again, wiping at his eyes. "Never in a million years did I think I'd be sitting across from him in a diner, drinking coffee with him." Keanu smiled, his own eyes misty. "Fate has a funny way of bringing people back together," he said. Walter nodded, his heart full. "That it does, son. That it does." For a long moment, they simply sat there, two souls forever connected by an act of kindness that had come full circle. Then, Keanu cleared his throat, his smile growing. "Walter, I think it's my turn to return the favor." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what do you have in mind?" Keanu grinned. "Well, let's just say, I don't think you should have to count coins for your groceries ever again." Walter frowned slightly. "Now, Keanu, I told you before, I don't take handouts." Keanu held up his hands. "Not a handout. Just an overdue thank you." Walter hesitated, but there was something in Keanu's eyes, something genuine, something sincere. And for the first time in a long while, Walter felt something shift inside him. Maybe, just maybe, it was okay to accept kindness in return. And so, as the sun set outside the diner's window, painting the world in hues of orange and pink, two men, one young, one old, sat together, bound by fate, by kindness, and by a simple winter night long ago. Little did Walter know, Keanu had something even bigger planned. Something that would change Walter's life forever. The unexpected twist. The night air was crisp as Keanu and Walter stepped out of the diner. the neon open sign flickering behind them. The world outside had slowed down, the once busy streets now quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the weight of their conversation still lingering between them. Walter tucked his hands into the pockets of his worn-out coat. His mind was still reeling from the revelation. The little boy he had helped all those years ago had grown up to be Keanu Reeves. It was almost too unbelievable to process. Keanu, on the other hand, had something brewing in his mind, something that had taken root the moment he realized who Walter was. He had built a life on the principle of paying kindness forward, and now, more than ever, he felt an overwhelming need to do something meaningful for the man who had once saved him from the cold. Walter broke the silence. "Well, Keanu, I won't lie. This has been one hell of a night." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm still not sure I believe it." Keanu smiled. "I know how you feel. But Walter, I meant what I said back there. I want to do something for you. You gave me a gift once. Let me return the favor." Walter waved a hand dismissively. "Now listen here, son. I appreciate it, I really do, but I don't need anything. I've made do with what I have. Besides, an old man like me doesn't need much." Keanu tilted his head. "You sure about that?" Walter nodded firmly. "I may not have a lot, but I have what I need." Keanu hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice easy, but his mind was already forming a plan. "How about this? You let me walk you home." Walter studied him for a moment before shrugging. "I suppose I can't say no to that." They started walking, the streets illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. Walter moved slowly with his cane, but Keanu matched his pace, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. After a few blocks, Walter gestured ahead. "That's me." Keanu followed his gaze and felt a pang in his chest. Walter's home was a small, run-down apartment building, the paint peeling from the walls, the windows fogged with age. It was clear that time and neglect had worn it down, and Keanu wondered how long Walter had been living there. Walter fished his keys from his coat pocket and unlocked the rusted metal door leading to the building's entrance. He turned back to Keanu. "You sure you don't have somewhere else to be, son? Some Hollywood party or a fancy event?" Keanu grinned. "I think I'd rather be here." Walter chuckled and shook his head. "Well, I appreciate the company." Keanu hesitated for a brief moment. "Walter, do you have family?" Walter's face softened. "Had a wife. Lost her a few years back. We never had kids. Just me now." Keanu nodded, his heart tightening at the thought of Walter living alone in a place like this. They reached Walter's door, and the old man turned back to Keanu. "I don't get many visitors, but you're welcome any time," he said sincerely. Keanu smiled. "I'll take you up on that." Walter nodded and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Keanu stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, his mind made up. Walter had given him a gift once. It was time to return the favor. The plan unfolds. The next morning, Walter woke up to the sound of a knock on his door. He grumbled slightly, adjusting his old robe as he shuffled to answer it. When he opened the door, he was met with a sight he never expected. Keanu stood there, smiling, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, a man in a suit, a woman holding a clipboard, and a few workers in construction vests stood waiting. Walter frowned. Son, what's all this?" Keanu grinned. "Walter, you said you don't need much, but I think you deserve more." Walter's eyes narrowed in confusion. "Keanu, what did you do?" Keanu took a deep breath. "I bought this building, Walter, and I'm getting it fixed up. No more leaks, no more broken heaters, no more stairs that creak like they're about to fall apart." Walter's mouth opened, but no words came out. Keanu smiled gently. "And one more thing. I got you a new place, a house, Walter. A place where you can live comfortably. No more counting pennies for groceries, no more struggling." Walter blinked rapidly, his throat tightening. Keanu, you didn't have to. I wanted to, Keanu interrupted softly. Walter, you changed my life. You gave me kindness when I had nothing. Let me do this for you. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the door. He wasn't used to people doing things for him. He had spent his life being the one who gave, not the one who received. But as he looked into Keanu's eyes, he saw something. Something that told him this wasn't charity. This was gratitude. This was a full circle moment, a debt repaid in the most unexpected of ways. Tears welled in his eyes, and he let out a shaky chuckle. Well, Dan, guess I better start packing. Keanu laughed, clapping Walter on the shoulder. That's the spirit. As the workers began discussing the renovation plans, Walter stepped back, taking it all in. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And it had come back to him, just as he had once given it away, on a cold winter night long ago. The next few days passed in a blur for Walter. He had never been the kind of man to accept help easily, but Keanu had left him with little choice. Every morning, a team of workers arrived at the old apartment building, hammering, painting, and fixing things that had been broken for years. The leaky ceiling, the unreliable heater, the cracked windows, all were being repaired. It was strange, waking up to the sound of life returning to a place he had long accepted as crumbling. But what shocked him the most was the house. Keanu had driven him there personally, taking the scenic route through the city, letting Walter soak in the moment before they arrived. It was a small home, not extravagant, not over the top, but warm, welcoming, and filled with light. A quiet little place on the outskirts of town, with a porch big enough for a rocking chair, a small garden in the front, and a fireplace inside. It was, in every way, perfect. Walter stood on the porch, his old hands gripping the railing as he stared out at the street. He had spent his whole life moving, adapting, making do with what little he had. And now, for the first time in years, he had a place to rest, a place to truly call his own. I don't know what to say, he finally muttered, his voice thick with emotion. Keanu, standing beside him, smiled. You don't have to say anything. Walter turned, shaking his head. I don't deserve this. Keanu's smile faded slightly. Why do you think that? Walter exhaled, staring out at the horizon. I've lived a long life, son. I've seen a lot, lost a lot. I made peace with the idea that some people just slip through the cracks. That's how it is. You do what you can, and then life moves on. Keanu nodded, understanding more than Walter knew. That's true, he said, but sometimes life circles back around. Sometimes kindness comes full circle. Walter glanced at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. You really believe that? Keanu nodded. I do. I'm standing here because of it. Walter let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Never thought I'd see the day where a movie star was helping an old man like me move into a house. Keanu grinned. Well, life is full of surprises. For the next hour, they walked through the house together. Walter took his time, running his hands over the wooden kitchen counter, testing the creak in the floorboards, gazing at the fireplace like it was something out of a dream. Every inch of the home felt surreal, like he had stepped into someone else's life. As they sat down on the couch, Keanu leaned back, stretching his arms. So, what do you think? Walter sighed, his fingers tracing the armrest. I think I could get used to this. Keanu smiled. That night, Walter slept better than he had in years. The next morning, Walter woke up early as he always did. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, watching the sunrise. The warmth of the cup in his hands, the quiet hum of birds in the distance, the feeling of a home that was truly his. It was a peace he hadn't known in a long time. As he sat there, lost in thought, a car pulled up in front of the house. Walter squinted, leaning forward slightly as Keanu stepped out, holding a paper bag in one hand and 2 cups of coffee in the other. Figured you might need breakfast, Keanu said, handing him the bag. Walter chuckled. You planning on doing this every morning?" Keanu shrugged, taking a seat beside him. "Maybe." Walter opened the bag, finding a simple breakfast sandwich inside. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was good. Warm, fresh, filling. He took a bite, nodding in approval. "Not bad." Keanu smirked. "Glad you approve." They sat in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee, watching the world wake up. After a while, Walter glanced at Keanu. "Why do you do it?" Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Do what?" Walter gestured vaguely. "All of this. The kindness. The generosity. You could live in a bubble of fame and wealth and never have to think about people like me. But you don't." Keanu was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the sky. "Because I know what it's like," he finally said. "To struggle. To feel invisible. To lose people you love and still have to keep going. And because I want to believe that the world can still be good." Walter nodded, understanding. They sat there for a long time, drinking their coffee, watching the sun climb higher into the sky. Neither of them knew it, but a passerby had noticed them, a man on his morning walk, recognizing Keanu, snapping a quick photo from a distance. By the afternoon, the photo would be everywhere. Keanu Reeves, sitting on the porch of a small, simple home, drinking coffee with an old man. No cameras, no red carpets. Just two people, two lives connected by fate, by kindness, by a winter night long ago. And the world would soon learn the story behind it. The legacy of kindness. The internet exploded with the image. A candid shot, Keanu Reeves, sitting on the porch of a small, unassuming house, drinking coffee beside an elderly man. The contrast was striking. Hollywood royalty in the most ordinary setting. No cameras, no luxury. Just two people sharing a quiet moment. Speculation ran wild. Who was the old man? What was Keanu doing in such a modest neighborhood? The photos spread like wildfire, making headlines in mere hours. Keanu Reeves spotted in small town. Heartwarming mystery unfolds. Who is the elderly man Keanu Reeves is sharing coffee with? Keanu's quiet act of kindness will restore your faith in humanity. But the real story was yet to be told. It wasn't until a local journalist decided to dig deeper that the truth came out. The small-town newspaper managed to track down Walter Thompson. They knocked on his door the very next day, and when he answered, he seemed genuinely surprised. "Journalists. For me." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Now I've really seen it all." At first, he hesitated to talk, not wanting any fuss. But when they asked about Keanu, about how they met, he knew the story was bigger than just him. Sitting on his new porch, he recounted the events of the past few days. The grocery store incident, the revelation about the boy he once helped, the house, the friendship. And by that evening, the world knew the truth. A veteran, once forgotten, once struggling, had unknowingly changed the life of a future Hollywood legend on a cold winter's night decades ago. And in a beautiful twist of fate, that boy had grown up to return the favor, ensuring the old man who had once saved him would never struggle again. The story resonated with millions. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about fame. It was about kindness. A simple act, a moment of generosity, coming full circle in the most unexpected way. Walter's quiet life was suddenly filled with letters, gifts, and messages from strangers who had been touched by his story. Veterans from across the country reached out to thank him for his service. People shared their own stories of kindness, inspired to help others in their communities. But through all of it, Walter remained the same. He still woke up early, still drank his coffee on the porch, still told Keanu he was doing too much. And Keanu, he kept visiting. Some days they talked about life. Some days they just sat in silence, enjoying the peace of the morning. One afternoon, as they sat watching the sunset, Walter looked over at Keanu. "You know, son, I don't have much time left." Keanu frowned. "Don't say that." Walter chuckled. "It's the truth. but I'm not afraid of it. You've given me more than I ever could have asked for." Keanu exhaled, looking out at the sky. "You gave me more than you'll ever know." Walter smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Guess that means we're even." Keanu shook his head, grinning. "Not even close." Walter passed away peacefully in his sleep a few months later. He had lived a full life, but in those last days, he had something he hadn't had in a long time: comfort, dignity, friendship. At his funeral, Keanu sat in the front row. There were no flashing cameras, no press, just a quiet gathering of people who had loved and respected Walter. Veterans, neighbors, people from the community who had come to know his story. After the service, Keanu stood by Walter's grave for a long time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a silver coin. He placed it gently on the headstone, a reminder of where it all began. A quiet promise to keep paying kindness forward. And as he walked away, he knew Walter would have smiled at that.